What if the biggest problem in your garden isn't the weeds, but the way you've been taught to deal with them? Because every time you pull one out, dig a little deeper, or go back week after week thinking you're winning, something else is already happening under the surface that most people never see until it's too late. The truth is that bare patch you just cleared doesn't stay empty. It fills fast, quietly, and usually with more weeds than before. And if that sounds frustrating, it should, because it means the real issue was never what you were pulling out of the ground. Welcome to Timeless Harvest, where we stop treating the garden like a constant battle and start understanding how it actually works. In this video, you're going to see 5 simple shifts that change everything, from how soil behaves to how weeds even show up in the first place. No complicated systems, no overworked routines, just smarter ways to get ahead of the problem so the garden starts working with you instead of against you. And by the end, you might realize you've been doing the hardest version of gardening this whole time without needing to. Let's get into it. The first strategy is something most people completely misunderstand because it feels too simple to actually work. Instead of pulling weeds over and over in the same soil, you stop exposing new ones in the first place by smothering what's already there and rebuilding the ground from the top down. This is where the idea of a layered garden bed comes in, often called a lasagna bed, but think of it less like a method and more like resetting the entire surface of your soil without digging, without breaking your back, and without waking up everything that's been waiting underground for years. You're not fighting the weeds anymore. You're cutting off their ability to even see the light they need to grow. It starts with something as ordinary as flattening what's already there, whether it's grass, old weeds, or compacted ground that refuses to behave. Instead of removing it, you block it. A thick layer of cardboard goes straight on top, overlapping so tightly that nothing underneath gets a chance to sneak through. Then comes water, not as an afterthought, but as a way of sealing that first layer into the soil, so it starts breaking down instead of staying separate from it. On top of that, you begin building layers of organic material, things like dry leaves, straw, kitchen scraps, and compost, alternating between carbon-heavy and nitrogen-rich materials, so the whole thing slowly transforms into living soil over time. Finished with a thick protective layer of mulch, what you end up with isn't just a bed that suppresses weeds, but a system that actively improves itself the longer it sits. And the moment you realize you've built something that feeds the soil while starving the weeds at the same time, you start to see why most gardeners never needed to be stuck in that endless pulling cycle in the first place. Strategy number 2, the stale seedbed trick. This next approach feels almost unfair once you understand it, because instead of reacting to weeds after they appear, you deliberately bring them out on your terms and deal with them before your real planting even begins. Most gardeners miss this entirely, because they assume the goal is to keep the soil clean all the time. But in reality, the most effective strategy is to let the weed seeds in the top layer wake up, show themselves, and then remove them in one clean sweep before your crops ever go in. It's a quiet reset phase that turns the soil from a surprise battlefield into something you can actually predict and control. Here's how it plays out in practice. You prepare your bed as if you're about to plant. Smooth soil, lightly water it, and then simply wait. Over the next days or weeks, the hidden weed seeds near the surface respond to light, moisture, and warmth, and they start to sprout all at once. That's your signal. Instead of planting immediately, you go back in and remove that first wave very shallowly, barely disturbing the soil, just enough to clear what has surfaced. Some gardeners use a rake, others a simple hoe, and in more intensive setups, even heat is used to eliminate that flush without turning the soil at all. Once that first wave is gone, your crops go into a space that has already been preloaded and cleared, meaning they're not competing with a fresh explosion of weeds from day one. It's not about working harder in the garden. It's about making the garden reveal its problems before your plants ever have to face them. The third strategy, living mulch and ground cover defense. At this point, the shift becomes even more interesting because you stop thinking of weeds as something to remove and start thinking about how to make sure they never get a chance to move in at all. The mistake most gardens make is leaving soil exposed, even for a short time, because bare ground is exactly what weeds are waiting for. The moment sunlight hits open soil, it's basically an invitation. So instead of constantly cleaning that space, the smarter move is to never leave it unclaimed in the first place. You fill it with plants that do the job of covering, protecting, and competing so aggressively that weeds don't even get a foothold. This is where living mulch changes everything. Instead of wood chips or straw doing all the work, you use low-growing plants that spread, weave, and lock the soil in place, while still allowing your main crops to grow above them. Think of plants that creep along the ground, forming a living carpet that blocks light, holds moisture, and physically crowds out anything trying to break through. Clover is one of the strongest examples because it spreads quickly and even improves soil as it grows, while creeping thyme brings both fragrance and coverage, turning empty gaps into dense, usable space. Even flowering ground covers like nasturtium can take over awkward corners before weeds get the chance. And once you start designing your garden in layers, tall plants, medium plants, and then a living ground layer underneath, the idea of weeding starts to feel less like a task and more like something the system simply doesn't allow anymore. So the question becomes, are you still gardening in open soil, or are you ready to let the plants do the gardening for you? Strategy number 4. Deep mulching. This is the point where everything starts to feel noticeably easier, because instead of constantly reacting to what's already growing, you begin to control what can even reach the surface in the first place. Deep mulching is not just a light cover you throw on the soil when you remember to do it. It's a full protective system that changes how the ground behaves. Most weed problems don't start with dramatic invasion. They start with light hitting bare soil. Once that light is blocked consistently, the whole cycle slows down dramatically. The soil stays cooler, moisture holds longer, and most importantly, weed seeds near the surface lose their signal to germinate. You're not removing weeds anymore. You're cutting off the conditions they depend on. The difference comes down to depth and consistency. A thin layer barely does anything beyond looking tidy, but a thick, properly maintained layer creates a barrier that weed seeds struggle to push through and often never get past. Materials like shredded leaves, straw, wood chips, or even layered organic matter all work, but the real power is in building it up enough that sunlight simply doesn't reach the soil underneath. Over time, that mulch doesn't just sit there, it breaks down, feeding the soil beneath it while continuing to block new growth above it. The result is a living buffer zone between your plants and the chaos of constant regrowth. And once you experience a bed where you're no longer weeding every week, but only occasionally adjusting and topping up mulch, you start to understand that the goal was never to fight harder, it was to make fighting unnecessary in the first place. Strategy number 5. Raising the entire system. At a certain point, the biggest improvement doesn't come from what you put on the soil, but from changing the soil's entire environment. Raised beds shift the whole equation, because they separate your growing space from the ground level where most weed problems begin. Instead of constantly dealing with whatever is already in the native soil, you're building a controlled zone where you decide the structure, the layers, and how much pressure weeds are even allowed to apply. It sounds simple, but this one change alone removes a huge part of the struggle that keeps most gardens stuck in a cycle of constant cleanup. When you raise your beds, you're also making it easier to manage everything around them. You can define clear borders, control pathways, and prevent surrounding grass or creeping weeds from slowly invading your growing space. Many gardeners combine this with a base barrier like cardboard or hardware cloth, then build upward with rich soil, so the bed starts off strong instead of being dependent on whatever was there before. Even the height matters, because the higher and more contained the system is, the less chance weeds have to spread into it unnoticed. And once your garden is physically structured this way, maintenance stops feeling like a constant reaction and starts feeling like simple upkeep. You're no longer chasing problems across open ground. You're managing a defined system that stays within its own boundaries, which is exactly where long-term control begins. And there you have it. 5 simple but powerful shifts that completely change the way you deal with weeds. Not by working harder, but by changing the conditions that allow them to take over in the first place. When you step back and look at it, the real transformation isn't just in the garden, it's in the approach. You stop seeing weeds as something you constantly have to chase, and start seeing them as a signal that something in the system needs adjusting. If this changed the way you think about your garden, tell me in the comments which strategy you've been doing already, or which one surprised you the most. And if you've got a stubborn weed problem that never seems to go away, describe it too. There's usually a simple reason behind it. Make sure you stay with Timeless Harvest, because next time we're looking at what to do when weeds still show up anyway, and how to deal with them without undoing all your work.